Hello, this is Franklin Graham, and I just want to say thank you for your generous support and prayers as we take the gospel of Jesus Christ around the world.
Franklin Graham has long been one of the most recognizable and influential religious voices in America. As the son of the legendary Billy Graham, he inherited not only his father's worldwide platform, but also the expectations that came with it. For decades, Franklin has been at the center of major faith-based initiatives, humanitarian missions, and public conversations that shaped national debate. But recently, headlines have shifted, and not in the way his supporters hoped. Over the past year, whispers have grown louder, concerns have mounted, and observers are beginning to question what exactly is happening behind the scenes in Graham's world. What began as quiet speculation has now escalated into widespread discussion, with many asking whether Franklin Graham is facing one of the most challenging chapters of his life and ministry. Some point to recent controversies that have placed him under intense scrutiny. Others highlight internal struggles, public criticism, and decisions that have raised eyebrows among both supporters and critics. His organization, Samaritan's Purse, is still powerful and respected, but even inside those walls, sources suggest tension, fatigue, and pressures that Graham hasn't faced at this magnitude before. And then there's Franklin himself, now in his 70s, navigating health scares, leadership responsibilities, and the immense weight of maintaining a global ministry during a time of rapid cultural change. His once unshakable public presence now carries a hint of vulnerability, leaving many wondering how long he can continue carrying the load that has defined his life. These growing concerns have sparked one pressing question: what is really going on with Franklin Graham, and why are so many saying things are no longer looking good? This story digs deep into the signs, the struggles, and the truth behind the headlines, revealing a side of Franklin Graham the public rarely sees. For most of his life, Franklin Graham has carried a name that evokes instant recognition around the world. As the son of Billy Graham, arguably the most influential evangelist of the 20th century, Franklin didn't just inherit a platform. He inherited a global expectation, a spiritual responsibility, and a burden that few could ever understand. For decades, he embraced that responsibility with confidence, expanding ministries, traveling the world, and speaking with a boldness that attracted millions. But as the years have passed, the pressures surrounding Franklin have only intensified, and today, those closest to him say the strain is beginning to show. Franklin's rise wasn't without struggle. As a young man, he faced personal challenges, bouts of rebellion, and a search for identity that took him far from the path his father hoped he'd follow. But when he eventually committed himself to ministry, he did so with incredible force. Under his leadership, Samaritan's Purse grew into one of the largest Christian relief organizations on the planet. His preaching tours drew massive crowds, and his public voice carried enormous influence in matters of faith, culture, and politics. However, over the last few years, the environment around Franklin has changed dramatically. The world he once navigated with ease has become more complex, more divided, and more demanding than ever before. The pressures of leading a global ministry during times of political tension, economic uncertainty, and cultural shifts have created challenges even Franklin's decades of experience couldn't fully prepare him for. Sources close to the ministry describe an increasingly heavy workload landing directly on Franklin's shoulders. With staff turnover, growing administrative demands, and international crises requiring constant attention, the responsibility has become relentless. Even for someone known for strength and determination, the non-stop pace has taken a toll. At the same time, Franklin's public image has faced significant pushes from all sides. Critics frequently target his statements, while supporters rely on him to be a steady voice in a confusing world. This pressure to satisfy millions while staying true to his convictions creates a strain few could sustain. Those close to him say the burden has grown heavier in recent years, with little opportunity to rest, reflect, or regroup. Behind the scenes, Franklin's age and health have also become quiet points of concern. Though he remains active, the pace at which he works would challenge someone half his age. Traveling, speaking, overseeing relief operations, and managing a global ministry require immense energy that becomes harder to sustain. As the years pass, while Franklin has not publicly discussed significant health issues, individuals familiar with his schedule say fatigue has become more apparent, and the long stretches of constant travel are no longer as effortless as they once were. Then there is the legacy itself, the shadow of Billy Graham, a man revered across the world. Maintaining that legacy while forging his own path has always been a delicate balance for Franklin. But now, as expectations grow and the world changes rapidly, that balance has become more difficult to manage. The pressure to preserve his father's ministry, uphold its values, and keep its global reputation intact has placed enormous emotional and spiritual weight on his life. While Franklin Graham has always been a figure accustomed to criticism, the challenges he faces today are far more complex than the typical friction that surrounds public religious leaders. In recent years, multiple internal pressures have converged, creating a climate of tension within his organizations and casting a shadow over the stability he once confidently maintained. Inside Samaritan's Purse and other Graham-led ministries, staff members quietly acknowledge that the last few years have been especially difficult. The demands of managing massive relief operations spanning natural disasters, international conflicts, and unpredictable crises have multiplied. Teams often find themselves stretched thin, juggling humanitarian needs in multiple countries at once. This has created burnout, turnover, and a deepening sense that the organization is operating at full capacity with little room for error. Employees who have worked closely with Franklin describe a man who has always pushed for excellence, who expects high standards, and who rarely takes his foot off the gas. But what once inspired teams to rise to the challenge has, under current circumstances, begun to create friction. The workload is heavier, the expectations higher, and the pace more relentless than ever. Some staff members have quietly expressed concern about the sustainability of this environment, not just for the organization, but for Franklin himself. Adding to this internal strain is the growing weight of public controversy. Franklin Graham is no stranger to strong opinions, and over the years, his bold statements on social, cultural, and political issues have generated both strong support and intense backlash. But recent controversies have hit harder than before, often feeding into polarized national debates. What once brought him admiration from his base now also brings waves of criticism that his team must constantly navigate. Every public statement now triggers an avalanche of reactions, articles, debates, online commentary, and the constant cycle of scrutiny takes a toll on the ministry's operations. Some supporters worry that the controversies distract from the humanitarian mission, while critics argue that they overshadow the legacy built by his father. Caught in the middle is Franklin, balancing conviction with responsibility, and increasingly aware that every word carries consequences. Behind the scenes, sources say these tensions have reached a point where the organization must choose between maintaining its long-standing public image or adapting to a rapidly shifting cultural landscape. Neither option is simple. The loyalty of supporters must be preserved, but the organization must also remain effective, neutral, and focused in a world where global crises are increasing at alarming speed. Another layer of challenge comes from financial pressures. Though Samaritan's Purse remains strong, the rising costs of global operations, logistics, and humanitarian aid have strained resources. Inflation, geopolitical instability, and the expanding scale of disasters have pushed budgets to their limits. Maintaining the same level of global presence now requires far more effort, coordination, and funding than it did a decade ago. Franklin, deeply involved in these decisions, faces immense stress as he works to keep operations functioning smoothly. Leadership experts observing from the outside note that it's common for long-standing organizations to face growing pains during generational transitions. Franklin's leadership style, strong, direct, and deeply rooted in conviction, has served him well. But the demands of modern humanitarian work increasingly require flexibility, delegation, and a slower pace. Those closest to him say the greatest concern isn't his passion, which remains unshaken, but the relentless pressure he carries alone, with internal strain, external controversy, and emotional fatigue all converging. The question many are asking is simple yet unsettling. How long can Franklin Graham continue under this weight? Franklin Graham had weathered storms before: public criticism, political backlash, even organizational challenges, but nothing felt quite like the pressure mounting around him now. What had begun as scattered whispers had rapidly transformed into a national conversation, one that questioned not only his leadership, but the future of his entire ministry. And while Graham publicly projected calm confidence, those closest to him knew the truth. Things behind the scenes were far more chaotic than he wanted anyone to realize inside the headquarters of Samaritan's Purse staff. But the external pressure wasn't the only challenge. Internally, Graham faced disagreements from within his own leadership board. A few advisors urged him to scale back, to step out of the spotlight for a while, to avoid giving critics more ammunition. Others, more loyal to his combative style, insisted that retreat would look like weakness. Graham found himself caught between two sides, neither fully wrong, neither fully right. That tension came to a head during a closed-door strategy meeting. Cameras were off, phones collected, windows covered. Graham sat at the head of the long conference table, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the documents spread before him. Then one board member finally said what others had been hinting at for weeks. "Franklin, the ministry is taking damage. Your name is overshadowing the mission." The room fell silent. Graham lifted his head slowly. He wasn't angry. He looked tired in a way no one had seen before. "I've given my life to this mission," he said quietly. "Everything I am, everything I've built, has been for the work. But I won't apologize for standing firm." Another advisor pushed gently. "You don't need to apologize, but you may need to shift. People aren't questioning your faith, they're questioning the direction." The air tightened. It was an acknowledgement of what Graham feared most, that he might be losing the very audience he had spent decades cultivating. That night, long after the building had emptied, Graham remained in his office. The lights in the hallway were off, leaving only the glow of his desk lamp. He stared at the framed photos on his wall: his father, Billy Graham, preaching to massive crowds, the two of them together during Franklin's early years of ministry. The emotional moment after Billy's final crusade. Expectations, legacy, responsibility, they all pressed down at once. He wondered what his father would have told him now. Billy Graham had navigated controversies, too, but never in an era where information spread globally in seconds. Franklin knew he couldn't simply push through the storm by force of will. Something had to change. But the question that lingered, the one he had avoided for weeks, was whether that change needed to start with him. As he sat in the quiet, a staff member knocked softly on the door. "Sir, there's something you need to see," they said hesitantly. The hallway outside Franklin Graham's office was dim, lit only by the emergency lights that hummed quietly overhead. The staff member who had interrupted his solitude walked quickly, almost nervously, as though unsure how Graham would react to what he was about to see. Graham followed without speaking, bracing himself for yet another crisis, but the weight in the staffer's voice told him this was different. This wasn't just another headline, another complaint, another financial report. Something deeper was unfolding. They entered the communications room, where a handful of team members stood clustered around a screen. Their shoulders tightened when Graham stepped inside. On the monitor was a live news broadcast, one that mentioned his name in the headline bar. The anchor spoke in that carefully measured tone reserved for scandals still unfolding. "Tonight, several former employees of Samaritan's Purse have come forward with allegations that raise serious questions about internal operations under the leadership of Franklin Graham." Graham froze, not because he had never faced accusations before. He had. But this time, the timing couldn't have been worse. The ministry was already financially stressed, public opinion already tense, donors already wavering. Now, these internal claims, some exaggerated, some outright false, some painfully true, were hitting all at once. The report continued, showing blurred faces of former staff and snippets of documents that were never meant for broadcast. Concerns about transparency, the reporter said. Concerns about spending priorities. Concerns about leadership decisions. One statement repeated over and over: "The ministry has lost its direction." A quiet gasp broke the room. Graham didn't need to turn to know who it came from. Every person watching knew this broadcast would spread everywhere within hours, and the narrative would take on a life of its own. He reached forward and switched off the screen. For a moment, no one moved. The room held a suffocating stillness, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Finally, Graham spoke. "How long have we known this was coming?" The communications director hesitated. "We'd heard rumors, but we didn't know it would go public tonight." Graham's jaw clenched. "It always goes public," he said quietly, almost to himself. It was a hard truth he had learned long ago. Anything hidden eventually surfaced, and usually at the worst possible time. He dismissed the room and returned to his office, shutting the door behind him. As he sank into his chair, he realized something he hadn't admitted until now. This wasn't just a momentary storm. This was a turning point. His ministry, his reputation, even his influence, everything was being tested at once. He picked up his phone and called an emergency meeting with his board. Within the hour, the conference table was filled again. This time, however, the tension was thicker, heavier, the atmosphere carrying a sense of impending consequence. One board member spoke first. "Franklin, this is serious. The media is running with it. Donors are already calling. We need a clear response." Another added, "We can't pretend nothing is wrong. We need transparency, and we may need to consider structural changes." Graham listened without interrupting, but his silence only encouraged stronger opinions. "We need to protect the mission above all," said the chief financial officer. "And if that means temporarily stepping back from the spotlight, even just to let things settle." The room went cold. Everyone sensed the line being crossed. Graham lifted his eyes slowly. "Are you telling me to step down?" "No," the CFO said carefully. "Not step down, but step back. Just long enough to regain stability." Graham looked around the table. For years, this board had supported him through every controversy, every criticism. But now their eyes told him the truth. They believed the ministry could not heal. While he remained at the center of the storm, he exhaled deeply. "Everything I've done," he said, voice low but steady, "has been for the ministry, for the work, for the calling." "We know," one board member replied gently, "but sometimes the calling requires sacrifice even of the things we love most." The words landed heavily, for the first time in a long time. Graham felt the full weight of what he might have to do. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about control. It was about legacy, his father's, his own, and the future of the millions the ministry served.